If you're not familiar with our work, welcome. I hope this is a great introduction. We do tons of events. We're doing year-round programming at this point. We just started a new series called the Merit Dialogue Speaker Series. It happens every 3 months. And we are going to be actually moving that to the new Parkway, where we're going to have Jeff Chang moderating. We're going to have live performances. We're going to have virtual speakers, in-person speakers. It's going to be a whole thing, and food and drink there at the new Parkway. So it should be a lot of fun. For the remainder of the year, I just want to put 2 events on your radar. If you have kids, no people with kids, Social Justice Children's Book Fair is happening at Emerson School here in Oakland. It's happening on December 6th. It happens, I think it starts at 11 o'clock and goes for about 5 hours. And it's a great place to meet independent children's book makers, authors, illustrators, and it's just a great community vibe. We're partnering with them on some of the programming, so you'll start to see some panels and discussions about the making of these books and the world of children's lit. So it should be super interesting. On December 13th, you may have seen it on the slides, we're doing Pints and Pages. It is a small press holiday book fair. It's indie presses from all around California, particularly the Bay Area. And it's just a place for you to come. There's food, there's drink, there's great books. Get your holiday gifts, get a beer, and call it a day. So hope you can make it. Without further ado, let's jump in. I have a few things to say, and I'm going to pass it off to our moderator extraordinaire. So if you have not gotten a chance to read this book, it is phenomenal. It will last a long time. It's quite a big book. We will have book sales at the end of the night and author signings as well. So there are moments when a book does more than enter the world, it changes it. So tonight we gather in the long and luminous shadow of James Baldwin, who taught us that language is not just a tool, but a home we must build and rebuild together. Over the past 30 years, countless writers, scholars, and artists have kept Baldwin's light alive, but Nicholas Boggs, with Baldwin, A Love Story, has given us the first full biography of Baldwin in 30 years. It's a tender and revolutionary act of love and attention. And in reading it, we are reminded that love, when it tells the truth, can be the most devastating and redemptive force that we have. Books like this remind us that the written word can hold our contradictions, our fire, our love, can turn silence into song. And that what we celebrate here, the unbroken line of writers who refuse to look away, who insist on naming what must be named, loving what must be loved. So with that, it is now my deep pleasure to welcome someone whose work continues this radical lineage, author of Chi Boy and many others, a prolific essayist, and so much more. Please welcome to the stage, Keenan Norris.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Yeah, it's dope to see everybody here, and here to celebrate Nicholas Boggs' Baldwin, A Love Story. This is a wonderful book, a wonderful exploration of Baldwin's life and work. But before we get to the book itself, I want to welcome to the stage a poet who, as I just have learned through our conversations backstage, like so many of us, has a deep and passionate relationship to Baldwin's work as well. Daniel B. Summerhill is a poet whose work explores the sacred in everyday life, weaving together grief, joy, and transformation with unflinching honesty. His poems carve out a space where vulnerability meets renewal, reminding us of the divinity in our human edges. If we could have Daniel please come out as well.
Good evening, folks. Hope we're doing all right. I was gonna stand, but this seems really intimate and cozy, so I think I'm gonna sit. and I'm going to share some poems. And I think it's probably important to preface the poems saying a bit about where the poems come from. So in writing about the peril of artists, James Baldwin said, in order for one to face oneself, one should vomit up the anguish. And so I wrote a collection of poems starting about 5 years ago when I was in the woods in Brewster, New York, in a fellowship from Baldwin for the Arts, coincidentally. And they didn't start out as a collection of poems in conversation with James Baldwin, but the deeper I got into the legacy, the mind, the work of his, the more it became a collection of poems. And so it's docu-poetics in a lot of ways. It's biographical in some ways, but it's also me grappling with my own singular point of view as someone who's from Oakland, which is like the West Coast version of Harlem in which Baldwin grew up. So Praying for Rain is the title of the collection, and it engages with Maya Angelou and Bertie's Baldwin, his mother, and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, etc., in which I'll get into in just a moment. But the title, Praying for Rain, comes from Nikki Finney's introduction to Jimmy's Blues, which is his only collection of poems. Finney got the quote after listening to Studs Terkel interview James Baldwin, and he asked James Baldwin, "Who are you now?" And after a very, very long James Baldwinian pause, James Baldwin responds, "Who indeed? I may be able to tell you who I am, but I am discovering who I am not. I want to be an honest man, and I want to be a good writer. I don't know if one ever gets to be what one wants to be. You just have to play it by ear and pray for rain." So the work in this project, Praying for Rain, is that, in which I converse with not just his life, but his poetics, which I think is often overshadowed by his brilliant fiction and nonfiction. He always thought of himself as a poet at first, and so I wanted to be in conversation with that. I'm going to read poems that are called bops, and it's a tradition or a form that's informed by the tradition of blues, which is deeply ancestral, which is deeply ingrained in the Black tradition. In the South, they're lyrical, the poems are, which is in the legacy of the blues tradition. They tell a story, and they grapple with emotions in the same way that the blues tradition does. They're all written in persona of James Baldwin, and they all include refrains that come from his work directly. All right. This first poem is called Bop. Jimmy interviews Malcolm posthumously. What I didn't mention is the poems, the bops, come from or in conversation with Remember This House, which is James Baldwin's unfinished manuscript in which he chronicled his relationships with Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, and Martin Luther King Jr. So these three poems that I'm going to share are those, and there's kind of biographical details that are important to know. One is that James Baldwin was in London at the time of Malcolm's assassination. You need to know that when Malcolm X stood up to talk and began to speak, the first thing he did was to wish peace onto the folks that were there in attendance. The refrain in the poem kind of chronicles Malcolm as a member of the Nation of Islam. The reference to Betty is, of course, his wife. That's what you need to know for this first one. Bop. Malcolm posthumously. I'm too optimistic to believe in paradise as a members only club, but there's a cloud of witness that hasn't left Harlem since '65. An ocean away in the melancholia of London, I stood amongst pillage in all its airs. Tell me, when you wished peace onto your assassinate, I used to be afraid of God. Then Iblis, now nothing. Agreed. Everybody wants to be God and he wants to be us. What's he like? Has he shown you to Betty's block? I hope it's lined fire lilies, as gold as Lumbumba's tooth. Legend is, they love him as much as they love you on this rock. It's winter again, and the rain hasn't come enough. Tell me, is it the storm or gravity pulling the sky down you fear the most? What came first, Mecca or Muhammad? I used to be afraid of God, then Iblis, now nothing. Isn't there always a fall? Isn't there always a nearer devil in our grasp? I'm still here. Outlives us as peril outlives prayer. A deity is a ritual. Brother, when they took you, all they left was your perfect tongue. Brother, where is your aging heart? Who do you claim to be? I used to be a god. Now, okay. So that's the first bop of the suite. This next one engages with Martin Luther King Jr. What you need to know about this is James Baldwin said well before he responded to interviewers quite often. James Baldwin wanted to impress. James Baldwin was super fond of those three folks who I just mentioned, despite what, I don't know, the popular opinion might have said. He was not at odds with any of them. In fact, he had a great deal of admiration for Malcolm and Martin Luther King, even though they were tried to be made out as enemies in some form or fashion. So there's an occasion in which Martin Luther King and James Baldwin would be attending the 100-year birthday of W.E.B. Du Bois, and James Baldwin didn't have a suit to wear, and he wanted to impress MLK, so he bought a new suit. And if you know James Baldwin, he was a small person in stature, so he had this oversized suit that he didn't have time to get tailored. So that's important to know. Dorothy, that's mentioned, is an allusion to Dorothy, who was the first person to be integrated into school. And they pulled Martin's body in a wagon to his grave. That's important to know. Bop. The journalist asked Jimmy what it was like when Martin died. Well, I suppose we could spend more time pretending I bought a new suit for Carnegie Hall. Bought a new suit with dues from Paris. Yes, it's true. He pays a price for an America which still leaves a balance. Well, I have a future held in the lungs of this great thundering silence, this sleeping giant. Lord, when you send the rain, think about it, please, a little. Lord, Dorothy still navigates a crowd like the devil's bullet, surrounded by saints dressed in all white. Oh, yes, I weep now. Yes, I weep again. Word is, they're hurling prayers into the air, hoping something sticks. I find myself amongst the mess on the floor, staggering the fissured healing ground. Lord, all over the alabaster, and they're calling it a revolution. Lord, the mule they promised us is pulling Martin's wagon to the grave. Lord, when you send the rain, think about it, please, a little. Well, I suppose the next thing to do is lie down here on this dirt road, in the path of that old, sweet chariot, wishing for it to swing down and carry us home. Precious Lord, here is your song in a strange land, Lord. What does it mean to repent in despair, Lord? What does it mean to lie in repentance? I know why we are still here. I've grown weary in the wake. Lord, send the rain. Okay. And just one last poem, last bop. Little known fact that James Baldwin, and despite what may have been said about the hyper-masculine, kind of nature of the Black Panther Party and how they kind of shunned James Baldwin because of his queerness and such. Despite all of that, he had deep relationships with several Black Panther Party members, including visiting Huey Newton when he was locked up in San Luis Obispo. So this last poem kind of imagines or reimagines that experience, and it kind of uses when James Baldwin threw Huey Newton a house party as the metaphor for the experience. It's called Boplicity, or Jimmy throws a house party for Huey Newton and everybody shows up with their instrument instead. A nurse is at the front door lobbying for a way into the funk, but packed the wrong tools, left blues back where bebop jumped over the hammer, sold God's imagination short. Now we're here dancing again. Bessie's song got my hips loose, and what good's a revolution without a two-step? Beloved, there's a party tonight, and everybody gonna be there. Tonight, in Oakland, we carve up maple wood and steel-toed boots, stomp keys into the myth of whiteness. Uncle Sam's teeth rattle. Huey clinks the bars with Plato's Republic between here. Conjures the 1 and 3 count. American chaos. Bass haunts the dichotomy. Counterproduces the violence. Troubles innocence. Tonight in Oakland, the party is everywhere, and we can't distinguish one riff from another. Black smoke funnels out the attic, and the lampshades crooked from the kick drum. Beloved, I said there's a party tonight, and everybody gonna be there. I'm trading in my gold tooth for a hand grenade at the back door. Morning glory, milkweed, poppy, the rest have names too, distinct and communal as sin. Would you believe me if I told you miracles were small enough to hold? Scorched amber, night blooms, forgive me. Sometimes the light blinds me to the light. Beloved, it's a party tonight. Everybody's here. Thank you.
Oh, my. Thank you, Daniel Summerhill. And please, everybody, can we get another round of applause for Daniel? This is incredible. Please, everybody, go buy his books, read his poetry, go to his events. That was incredible. All right, so I want to welcome to the stage the author of the scholar, writer, and author of Baldwin, A Love Story, Nicholas Boggs, who offers a deeply compassionate and rigorous biography of James Baldwin, bringing new life to Baldwin's legacy through meticulous research and profound emotional insight. Everybody, please welcome Nicholas Boggs. Hopefully that's still working. No, well we can go back and forth with this one if necessary. Yeah.
All right, this one works. Hi, everybody.
Hey, well, Nicholas, or can I call you Nick? Or?
You can call me Nick, absolutely.
All right. First of all, I just want to say once again, as I did backstage, thank you for writing this book. I shared with you that my father gave me James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain when I was 13 years old, said, read this, and you'll know more about who I am. And so Baldwin has always been close to me clearly. It's really a lifelong relationship that you've had with Baldwin's work. I've got a few questions. So if we could, can I just jump in?
Absolutely. Go for it.
Okay. So your book is titled Baldwin, A Love Story. Can you tell us about the love stories, at least one or two, that are most important to your telling of Baldwin's life?
Well, there's actually 4 love stories in this book, and I'll just talk about the first one for starters, because in a way I think that's the most important one, or the most formative one for him. The book begins, there's a prologue where he is taken to see a movie starring Bette Davis, and he sees her eyes on screen, and he recognizes that they look like his eyes, which look like his mother's eyes, which is a revelation for him, because he was sort of told that he was ugly by his father because of his eyes. But the first person who really allows him to see himself as an artist and as a beautiful young man was the painter Beauford Delaney. So book 1 in this long book is called Beauford. And that's because it opens when Baldwin was 16 years old, and he went down to his Greenwich Village studio from his after-school job at a sweatshop. And he'd been told to go there from a friend, a high school friend who knew him. And Baldwin entered his studio, and here's this 37-year-old small man like him, preacher's son like him, who is a village eccentric, but also a pretty well-known artist at that point. Now his paintings are worth millions of dollars. But at that point, he was this sort of eccentric, Buddha-like figure who hung out with people like Marian Anderson and Georgia O'Keeffe. So Baldwin went in there, he stared at him with these X-ray eyes, and he became Baldwin's spiritual father. He painted portraits of Baldwin. He introduced him to blues and jazz, which wasn't allowed in his house because for religious reasons. And he taught Baldwin how to see as an artist. So I'll just tell that one story. They were walking down Broadway together one day, and Beauford points down at a gutter and says, "Look, what do you see?" And Baldwin said, "I see a gutter." And he says, "Look again." And Baldwin looked this time, and he saw that sort of in the watery reflection, there was this beautiful image of the buildings all around. So he saw that this was a moment where he was teaching him how to look at the world as an artist. And he also sort of, through these paintings of him and through his mentorship, he taught Baldwin to see himself as an artist and to see himself not as that ugly boy that he'd been told he was.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, it's so heartbreaking on the one hand to know that, Baldwin was, that his, father and other people told him that he, was ugly or wasn't beautiful. And I just find Baldwin's eyes so captivating. Images of Baldwin are so incredible. But you brought up Beauford. My next question was about Beauford anyway. So, and you focus, more than I think many other biographers and other just tellers of Baldwin's life. You focus more on Beauford. My question, I guess, is why do you feel like Beauford, in a relative sense, escapes notice relative to other of Baldwin's kind of elders and mentors and so forth?
Well, he was covered in a couple of biographies. David Leeming's very important 1994 biography of Baldwin. He also wrote a biography of Beauford called Amazing Grace, which is excellent. But it's true that in sort of the broader consciousness, for example, a really important documentary, The Price of the Ticket, that came out a couple of years after Baldwin's death, is fantastic. But there's no Beauford Delaney in it, which is kind of shocking because this was his spiritual father, the man who, as I just said, these are Baldwin's words, he said, "He taught me a black man could be an artist." I mean, he was absolutely life-changing, and they've remained close throughout the entire life. Baldwin kind of took care of him when he was aging and when he died. So this was a kinship structure that sustained both of them. They both moved to Paris eventually throughout his life. So it was surprising that he wasn't there. And there are a couple of reasons. I think their relationship was very complicated and hard to explain, right? Baldwin was 16. He met him when he was 37. Beauford fell in love with the 16-year-old Baldwin. But Baldwin was going through a lot at that moment, wrestling with his own sexuality, he was leaving the church, and he kind of told Beauford that he couldn't handle anything beyond that, and Beauford respected that, and it's an example of kind of a complex intergenerational relationship being worked through and turned into this long-standing love relationship still, but kinship. So how do you write about that in a way that captures those complexities? It was a different era then as well. And the reality is that was one of the challenges in this book, period, is that Baldwin had these complex relationships with other men, whether it was Beauford who had these feelings for him, or Baldwin had these relationships with Lucien Happersberger, Engin Cezzar, and Yoran Cazac, where these men were mostly involved with women, but sometimes with Baldwin. And so how do you, as Baldwin put it in an interview, the word gay never would have meant anything to my lovers. So how do you write about those relationships using the English language when the English language can't quite capture the complexities and the sort of shifts in those relationships over the course of a lifetime?
In your, having written this biography, having, spent 25 years, right, studying Baldwin, what's your take? He was certainly drawn to men who were sometimes married to women, right? Generally, who had long-term relationships with women. What's your take on that? you know? Yeah.
Well, I think it's very complicated. Am I speaking too close to the microphone? Okay, thank you. Why did nobody tell me? Okay. So basically, everywhere else I've been doing these talks, it was a different feedback system, so I apologize. But Nat, can you hear me okay now? Because I don't want to yell at you about Baldwin's love life. Okay. So Baldwin, that story I told you about his eyes, right? He grew up with this being told he was ugly. So his journey to self-love was very hard won, right? Over the course of his whole life, particularly his early years. And his journey to finding love was also a big part of that. So when he moved to Paris, and he fell in love with this young Swissman who was 17, Baldwin was 24, named Lucien Happersberger. And they fell deeply in love, and Lucien took Baldwin to a Swiss chalet that his parents had in the Alps. And this is where he nursed Baldwin back to health. This is where he took him on a hike, and he came up with the title for his first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain. He listened to those Bessie Smith records that you just heard about, in this town where he was the only black person for miles. So that was the origin of his important essay, Stranger in the Village. But this was the first time that he felt seen and loved and all of that. But his creative process got very tied up in this kind of yearning for somebody that was impossible. So right after he finished that novel, he gets told that actually Lucien's girlfriend is pregnant and he's going to marry her. So they break up. So just the birth of him as a novelist was sort of rooted in this sort of romantic trauma also. And in one way or another, not to get too schematic, but that ended up organizing his entire creative life. He would get back with Lucien and then go away to an artist residency, and that's where he wrote Giovanni's Room, in the middle of a big breakup with him. But I also think there was something about his character. He also had a kind of impossible love affair with the United States, right? This was a country that he talked about how much he loved it, but that gave him permission to criticize her perpetually. So he used this kind of distance and this yearning to kind of write productively about the situation back in the States. So both on a kind of creative level and a personal level, I think he became wired into this kind of creative process.
Yeah, thank you. And since you started to speak at some length about Baldwin's creative process, one thing I was really struck by in the construction of the book, and maybe I'm seeing things, but is that when we get into Baldwin's 20s, as he becomes a serious writer of novels, is attempting to write what eventually becomes Go Tell It on the Mountain, it seemed to me from thenceforth to his death, part of the way that you constructed the book, or one way to read it, was as the journey, the struggle to write each one of these novels. That helped to create some of these arcs within his life. And I don't know how familiar people are with the kind of general criticism of Baldwin's work, but the general idea is that Baldwin was a better essayist than he was a novelist, so forth and so on, and thus, so it is very striking that the construction of the book really follows the construction of the novels. Yeah, can you speak to that?
Yeah, there's that dominant idea that he's a much better essayist and a better novelist, and then the second one is that he was a good writer early on, and then there was this huge decline. What I discovered writing this book and researching it is actually how intertwined the nonfiction and the fiction are, that you can't actually read them separately, certainly in terms of his creative process. So, for example, another country, he writes when he goes over to Istanbul, right? And he can't finish it. He's been writing it for years. And he gets there, once again, writing from another place now allows him to write another country about America. So he had to get abroad. He had to be with Engin, which is a whole other story. But you can't understand The Fire Next Time. This is not well known, but he wrote almost all of The Fire Next Time in Istanbul. So while he's going back and forth to be engaged in the civil rights movement, he's considering Istanbul his home with all these activists and radicals and artists and scholars. He's created this new family, he calls it, with Engin Cezzar, this actor, his wife. And he puts on plays there. It's a whole thing. But The Fire Next Time and Another Country are so twinned, right? So Another Country is kind of a love story, like all of his novels, but it's about the kind of the impossibility of kind of interracial love and affection in America. But working through that with the characters, he was able then, when he wrote The Fire Next Time, to write those really important lines about how Americans must, like lovers, come together to kind of face the past and the future and to make freedom real. So what he was working through in his fiction, and he thought of himself first and foremost as a novelist. That's what he always said, that he was a novelist, and that was his passion. So, putting aside for a second questions of aesthetic merit, that's not necessarily for me to say, but what's clear is when you're trying to understand Baldwin's significance as a cultural figure and as a writer, as an artist, you have to look at these genres together, and actually the poetry and the drama as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, that came so clear to me. Just the drive to write these novels in so many ways. How he built himself as a writer. You mentioned Istanbul. And I think, at least in the States, when people think of Baldwin and place, you think of Harlem and you think of Paris. We don't think about Istanbul nearly as much. Why do you think that is? And what would you like to tell us about, other than what you've already told us, about Baldwin and Istanbul?
Yeah, so Istanbul, like I said, and I know this from having have read two sources. One of them, his letters. If you look at his letters, you see that he was there for more than half of his time was spent in Istanbul. Moreover, if you look at the FBI files, the FBI files were terrible and evil, but the one good thing about them is that they tracked his flights really carefully. So for a biographer, this was incredibly useful to know where he was. How did he end up in Istanbul? That was a little bit happenstance. So in the late 50s, he's putting together, he's trying to make Giovanni's Room into a play. An actor's studio does a rendition of it. And there's this young Turkish actor named Engin Cezzar who plays Giovanni. And Baldwin sort of falls for him romantically. You have to read the book to figure out how that all goes. But they become what they call blood brothers. They cut their arms and mix their blood, and they create this sort of alternative family. And he follows Engin there in 1961. And he stays, and I have to go backwards to explain why he stays in Istanbul. So when he got to France, he loved that he didn't understand French. He loved the alienation of the language. It's also why he loved the alienation when he was in that Swiss village. He fed on being a stranger in the village. He fed on being a stranger in the language, so he could rehear through Bessie Smith his own childhood, so he could find that voice for Go Tell on the Mountain. But then he became super famous, right, in the 60s, right? And so he couldn't really be in New York. He couldn't really be in France. And so he needed to go to Istanbul and by this time he'd learned French, how to speak French. So he moved to Istanbul and he never learned Turkish because once again, he enjoyed this sort of linguistic alienation, this cultural alienation. And there was also, I think, a kind of melancholy. Who's been to Istanbul? It's a beautiful, fascinating city, and I went there multiple times. My research assistant is Turkish because it's such an important part. There's a kind of melancholy. Orhan Pamuk describes the melancholy that kind of hangs over the city, a kind of post-imperial fatigue, as he puts it. And I think that appealed to Baldwin because of his own melancholic spirit and his melancholic kind of relationship even to America and democracy. So, but part of the reason that he stayed there is that the thing about Istanbul in that period is you could not even make a phone call back to the United States. So Americans would go there and completely disappear. I mean, you could really disappear from everyone except maybe the FBI. So that was really what he needed, because you have to remember, at this period, Medgar Evers is shot and killed. Malcolm X, MLK. Baldwin is legitimately afraid for his own life, and in order to be creatively productive, he can't be terrified. So the last point I'd say is, before the last time he came back in 1969 and put on a play, he had been in Hollywood. Right? And we can talk about that later maybe, but he had such a terrible experience trying to get Malcolm X screenplay written for Columbia Pictures that he returned to Istanbul where he directed a play, Fortune in Men's Eyes, which was this really radical kind of homosexual prison play. And it was this very socially conservative country. But he was so famous that he was able to pull it off, and it was a huge smash hit and transformed Turkish theater for decades. So, And he loved there. It was not like America, where he couldn't get Malcolm X made. Right. He couldn't get his plays were, Blues for Mr. Charlie was taken off Broadway. There he was embraced. He was given creative power and creative vision. So he was able to do that in Istanbul in a way that he never could in the States.
Yeah, I think that's such an important part of Baldwin's story to tell and for people to know. Well, you mentioned I have questions here, but I think that your commentary raises other questions that are better questions than the ones I have here. But it dovetails, right? You mentioned earlier the kind of dominant narrative of Baldwin's sort of rise and fall, quote unquote, as an artist, being in like inverse relation to his rise and fame, right? And politicization of his work, right? But you mount a very strong argument, I feel, in the book for the reevaluation of Baldwin's work in the 70s and 80s. So whether you want to talk about the Malcolm X movie that didn't happen or Just Above My Head, can you just talk about that reevaluation that you feel that, should be had?
Yeah, I tried to not make any arguments in this book, but through the storytelling to allow it to unfold and show the way that he was. No, I'm not disagreeing with you, but there is an argument, but I tried to kind of allow the story, an alternative history of his rise and fall from fame to unfold so that people could make their own judgments, go back to the work themselves. In the epilogue, I do absolutely, I believe that his later work has been misunderstood. Just for one example, No Name in the Street, the essay in the early 70s, which young people are turning to now as so prescient for our moment, in part because it's a diagnosis of sort of the failure of the civil rights movement, a failure of white liberals and of white America to live up to what they said they were going to do. That really resonated during the Black Lives Matter movement, which is ongoing, of course. But also, it's just a beautifully written, constructed, amazing essay, in its own right. And that's the thing about Baldwin. He's a first-rate artist, so his work would matter now no matter what, just as historical record. But because it speaks to our moment so powerfully, it makes it all the more important to sort of argue against this narrative that his later work isn't great. Because his later work, he moved further to the left. I mean, way further to the left in the 70s and beyond. But he's also writing, If Beale Street Could Talk, which became this sort of love letter to the black family and to black America, which is interesting because some people had issues with him because they thought he was too invested in interracial coalitions, right? But then he's also writing this novel, which interestingly, it's a black heterosexual love story set in Harlem, but it's actually dedicated to Yoran Cazac, so it's based on this queer, interracial, transatlantic love affair that he's having in his real life. So there's some interesting, with Baldwin you always have to look at all these different layers, but then he comes back in Just Above My Head and he writes this great, rambling, but excellent black queer love story in 1979, and it's about black love, but it's also about a black family accepting their queer son, which is so groundbreaking. In 1979, I mean, that's just incredible. So that novel also is just groundbreaking in terms of how it explores very explicit sex, and he did that in Beale Street as well. He was ahead of his time in many ways. And then there's his children's book, which I helped bring back into print, Little Man, which is really interesting and odd and special book. But even his later essays, Freaks and the American Ideal of Manhood, he's writing about like what we might even think now as trans identities. He's writing about androgyny. He's seeing himself as androgynous. He's saying that we're all actually androgynous. His quote is, "Each contains the other, male and female and male, black and white and black." So he was already writing about things that are with us now, evidence, things not seen. He was writing about issues that I think are coming up now in terms of smartphones and how black suffering is too available on these phones to young people. So he was way ahead of his time in so many ways.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, let me see. Your commentary raises additional questions and additional insights. I was
making him go off script. This is good.
Yes, you are. I guess, I was really struck also in the book by your willingness to speak to Baldwin's the complexity of his politics, right? And the ways that again, we have this dominant narrative of Baldwin, but can you speak some to those political complexities and how, especially in the 70s, right? He's maybe in the 70s and 80s, he's repositioning himself relative to maybe some of the failures of the civil rights movement, also the demands that are made on him in the 1980s as well. Could you speak to his evolving politics in the 70s and 80s?
Sure. I think we should go back to the 60s, actually, before we get there, because that moment was so complex. Even the March on Washington, right? He wasn't, people probably know this, but he wasn't allowed to speak there. He was going to speak, and then he wasn't. And instead, so what had happened is he had been in Paris, and there had been a march of African Americans in Paris supporting the March on Washington. And he'd written this beautiful essay that was really about black liberation globally, not just in the States. So when he came back, they didn't want him to read it for a few reasons, and we'll get to that. But and this is the weirdness of the interracial history of this country during the Civil Rights Movement. Instead of reading it himself, they asked Burt Lancaster to read it. So there's a video of Burt Lancaster, going on and on about black liberation globally, and the crowd, I mean, here I am talking about black liberation globally, but the crowd is just like, what? You can sort of, it's like things start floating in the wind. It's like you can hear the crowd just kind of, and people often said, and I think there's some truth to this, that the reason that he wasn't allowed to speak was because he was homosexual or whatever. I think there's some truth to that, but Malcolm X said, which I think is even truer, that they didn't want him to speak because they couldn't control him. They didn't know what he was going to say, right? Yes. He would go off script, and I think that's, we'll never know it's probably a little bit of both or a lot of both. But anyway, just to show how his positioning was already so complex vis-a-vis the civil rights movement in the 60s, right? And he didn't even really want to be a spokesman. He saw himself as an artist, but he made this trip. He came back and made his first trip to the South in 1957 to write 2 articles. And this is when he met Martin Luther King for the first time. And this is when he saw burning crosses for the first time. And he was really quite traumatized by the experience, but he was also incredibly moved. He had left the black church, remember, even though it's remained with him in his writing in many ways. But then he went to the church, and he was reminded that not only was it this space of community that he had really missed, but it was also now a space of political mobilization. And that was really, really powerful for him. So he already came in with this complex set of personal and political reasons why the civil rights movement, he wanted to be an artist, he didn't want to be a spokesperson, why this was already difficult. But once he got into it, right, he understood that he was a witness, as he put it, and this was the calling in a way that he had to do. So reluctantly, he became super involved with the civil rights movement in the 60s, but he was also kind of the darling of white liberals at this period, right? Go Tell It on the Mountain was this huge hit, not huge hit, but it was and his essays were not, he really believed in the possibilities of interracial coalition in the 60s, and he wrote about that. But by the time the 70s came, he was like, this is not working. He was very, very frustrated. And so he was, the irony is that even though he was rejected by many black nationalists, think about Eldridge Cleaver, he was actually extremely close ideologically to their positions come the 70s, right?
Yeah,
and he really, really very much wanted to be accepted by them. He didn't care what the white mainstream thought anymore, but he was very hurt when he was rejected by people like Cleaver or Amiri Baraka. So there's that complexity to his politics as well. And then, of course, he's abroad. So a lot of people were like, well, you can't be the main voice on these issues. You're out there. By this time, he'd moved to the south of France, was living in this beautiful property, drinking his wine, having Nina Simone come through, and Miles Davis and Marlon Brando. So in a sense, he could seem to be out of touch, right, with what was happening politically back in the States. But he was so engaged in his writing, and he was still coming back and doing lectures and all of that. So it was very painful for him, actually, that period.
And, you brought it up earlier in this same general period. You brought up the Malcolm X movie before and the difficulty of that experience for Baldwin. Can you speak a bit more about that?
Yeah, so one thing that my overall goal in this book was to humanize Baldwin. I mean, not that he needed me to humanize him, but there weren't these insights into these relationships that sustained him and that where he found love and that enabled him to create this work. And when he went out to Hollywood, he fell in love a little bit with Billy D. Williams because he wanted him to play Malcolm X. And he was working on this screenplay. And not only did Martin Luther King get shot, he was in Palm Springs when he got the phone call. But not unlike the Burt Lancaster silliness, Columbia Pictures wanted Charlton Heston to play Malcolm X. So those two, yeah, just
sit with that for a second, y'all. It's a showstopper. I mean, go on.
Although actually back then, Charlton Heston's politics were quite different than they became. But so imagine, I mean, that's silly and awful and such a symptom of so much that was wrong and still is wrong with Hollywood. But to then have to have MLK shot at the same time, this was one of those times that he attempted to take his own life. This is something that happened many times in his life, and this was one of them. And then afterwards he left Hollywood and didn't go back because he said, "I split to save my life," and that's when he went to Istanbul. In Istanbul, he was able to get away from these divisive and crazy racial politics and be kind of embraced as a person, right, first and foremost, so that he could go back and write about the insanity of his country at the time.
So we move, through the 70s into the 80s, and I'm curious about a number of things, as relates to Baldwin in the 1980s. He has these unfinished manuscripts, right? These ideas that are, or they're more than ideas, but stories that are left on the cutting room floor essentially at his death. He has their political energies and crises that he is certainly aware of and respondent to, but maybe not to the extent that people wish he was. Can you speak to Baldwin in the 80s? I know that's a really big question, but narrow in on any part of it they'd like.
Yeah, and the Baldwin in the 80s, he's living in St. Paul de Vence. He's teaching occasionally at UMass Amherst, and he's really supporting the early careers of writers like Gail Jones, and he's in these difficult conversations with black feminists like Audre Lorde, and his conception, I mean, one of the things that I really admire about Baldwin is that he was willing to change his mind about things, which is something I think this country could learn from. He changed his mind about Palestine is one example. He changed his mind by moving further to the left politically in terms of the civil rights era. And he also changed his mind about gender. He really did. He was writing, as I said, those essays, but in the 80s he was also, people sometimes say, well, he never talked about AIDS enough, right? The AIDS epidemic. But I actually found in a late interview that he did with a young friend of his where he does actually talk at length about it. And in fact, his final play, The Welcome Table, which was never fully performed, but it's kind of brings it all together. The main character is a woman based on him that he wanted to be played by Lena Horne. And she's kind of an aging singer diva, kind of like he was starting to see himself as. And she has a house in the south of France, right, where all these people are coming to visit, including a character based on Henry Louis Gates, who actually did visit Baldwin in the south of France and interviewed him and Josephine Baker. Time magazine wouldn't publish it. That's just to tell you what was going on sort of in the 80s. They said he was passé. So he's dealing with these feelings of being no longer relevant, but he's still producing work that is relevant. And he's also writing these later essays, Freaks in the American Ideal of Manhood, and the introduction to his Price of the Ticket, where he's going back and looking in an even more truthful way at his childhood, right? Including kind of some negative sexual experiences that he had,
but also some sort of positive, his relationship with Beauford Delaney and the mentorship. That's when he's writing about then. So he's really at a point in his life where he's reflecting back, but he's also writing about these sort of cutting-edge issues like the Atlanta child murders. He writes a whole book about that got panned, but I actually thought it was saying some very interesting things that are still with us around the media coverage of crime and stuff like that. So I think that, he was, he died in 1987, so he didn't make it all the way through the 80s, but he was, writing about Reagan. He was, I think he would have a lot to say today about AI, no, even just about artificial intelligence. Like I just did this AI event in New York, and I wondered, they created a typewriter based on Baldwin and kind of used AI to sort of speak back to you. And I thought, again, because Baldwin was so idiosyncratic and changed his mind, I would never presume to know what he would say about AI. But I would love to know, because I'm sure he would have something. He was so about human connection. I think he'd have a real issue with sort of the artificial intelligence. But I think he'd have something to say that none of us have actually been able to articulate.
And your comments bring up a couple things for me. One, it really strikes me that in Just Above My Head and then in Welcome Table, he does what he said in the 60s, I guess, he was unable to do in terms with I guess late 50s with Giovanni's Room. He was asked why he didn't write about a black gay man. He said, I can't write about race and homosexuality at the same time. It's just too much, right? And so it's very striking, that growth, right, as an artist. But you spoke to Baldwin. You spoke to a couple things. One, I apologize if I kind of glossed over the fact that you mentioned earlier your work with your, sort of rediscovery of Little Man, Little Man. And so that brings to the fore Baldwin as a writer of a children's book, Baldwin writing work that appeals to young people. And then you just talked about Baldwin and the current moment. Baldwin has sort of been elevated or has risen to this kind of identity as cultural icon at this point. So if you could talk about Baldwin, his appeal to young readers and listeners to this day, and about Baldwin as what Baldwin's work tells us about our current moment, or how it speaks to our current moment.
Okay. How much time do we have? No, I'll answer that very quickly. Again, to say that I don't feel comfortable. People ask me like what Baldwin would say now, and I actually don't feel again, because he was unpredictable, idiosyncratic, and it's not for me to say. I think turning to his later work, but I will say why young people I think are drawn to him, at least the ones that I used to teach and that I speak to, is a bunch of reasons, and it's not just that he can be easily put onto Instagram and TikTok, although he can, right? He's amazing for that reason. And one of the reasons I wrote this biography in the way that I hope that young people, many are reading it, but I hope more people will really engage substantively with his life and his work, not just in these sort of short. And it's a long book, but I'm hoping that young people will read it. There's that famous interview where he's asked, "You grew up black, poor, and gay. Like that must have been so hard. And how was that?" And Baldwin said, "I hit the jackpot, because I had all these different perspectives." Mm-hmm. And I think the thing about Baldwin is that he speaks to so many different quote-unquote constituencies. He can speak to a black queer kid, a black straight kid, a black questioning kid, a white gay kid, a mixed race kid, women. He speaks to everybody. He's a truth teller, and he's funny, and he's speaking to their issues. And he always said, he wrote that children's book for adults and an adult's book for children, he said, because he didn't like it when people talk down to children. Right, and he does not, for all of his sermonic pontification, he's not speaking down to anybody. I don't think. Even racist white America, he was. One of the remarkable things about him is bless his soul, because he was able to sit down with total racists and have these deep and long conversations with them. He was insatiably curious about other humans, but also he wanted to understand. He wanted to get inside this kind of psychosocial, sexual dynamics of racism to understand it. He always said that black people understand white people better than they understand themselves. Mm. And he did. That's why he was able to write like Going to Meet the Man, which from the first-person perspective of a racist white sheriff, right? So I'm not sure how that goes from why young people
It was
like
a broad
him.
question.
I think his curiosity, like this unending curiosity about people and young people. The Little Man was a children's book for adults and an adult's book for children. So he was always also pushing the boundaries of these genres. This was in the 1970s in ways that have been happening more with YA literature now, but he was doing it back then.
Yeah, thank you. And I know soon we're going to go to questions, correct? But let me see. So if you have questions, start to formulate them. Sorry, your commentary around Baldwin's respect for the intellect, right? Of all these different people, and thus his unwillingness to speak down to anybody. I'm reminded of that. He's in Paris. It's at like the height of his fame, and he ends up having like this long conversation with, it was like a Southern senator or something. I'm forgetting who this guy was. But it was really spoke to his broad-mindedness and his willingness to engage, right? Yeah.
And how strategic he was. So that incredible meeting, and then I really do want to hear questions or just a conversation. So I hope we can turn it over. But this one thing I write about in the book really closely is that amazing meeting that he had with RFK.
Yes.
This was like a year or two before the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So it's a meeting that they thought was just going to be Baldwin and a few of his friends and behind closed doors. But Baldwin, very strategically, that morning he has a meeting with the drama critic at the New York Times to talk about Blues for Mr. Charlie. But he sneaks in at the end. He said, "Oh, and by the way, I'm having this meeting with RFK later today, and Lena Horne's going to be there, and Harry Belafonte is going to be there." And the reporter was like, "Oh my gosh, okay, can I tell my colleagues?" And Baldwin was like, "Sure." So it was supposed to be behind closed doors. Lorraine Hansberry's there. Jerome Smith, the freedom rider, was there. And it turns into, and then Kenneth Clark, the psychologist, called it the most dramatic meeting he's ever been in his life, because they just totally blew that place up. And what it did is, and Baldwin really came at them for not taking a moral position on civil rights. And that was a language that the president then started using pretty soon after that. But what happened was, Baldwin afterwards, Lorraine Hansberry stormed out, and there were all these conflicting accounts of what happened. It's almost comedic. But the next day, one of the few black reporters at the New York Times covered the piece, and I'm convinced that there was some kind of backdoor machinations happening. And instead of it says that there's an explosive situation, but instead of it has these beaming, beautiful, smiling photos of Baldwin, Lena Horne, and Lorraine Hansberry. So it was like he was creating this publicity stunt to get this coverage to work, and it worked to a certain extent. I mean, 2 years later, Civil Rights Act. They started hiring more African Americans in the government. So Baldwin was very curious about the human condition, but also he could be very strategic when it mattered in terms of this kind of activism.
Yeah, you even speak to how it changed RFK's rhetoric.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Started talking about the moral responsibility of the country.
Yeah.
All right, so we are going to move over to Q&A. If you have a question, just put your hand up. There's one over there already. We have one right here, and Ashley is the person that's going to be taking the mic around.
Nick, I want to know when you first knew that you were going to spend the rest of your life being Baldwin's biographer. And also, I want to hear you talk about the Schomburg and Beinecke and other documentary sources.
Sure. So the Schomburg archives are that's kind of when I really realized I could write this biography. Those became available in 2017. The Beinecke has incredible archives those are the two main repositories for Baldwin. I think everybody in this room, has the first moment that Baldwin impacted them. For me, I was in 8th grade English class in the DC public schools, where I was one of the few white students, and my teacher, Mrs. Miles, had put on the walls drawings of famous, mostly African-American authors, and Baldwin was one of them, and I just remembered his eyes. Like, I saw his eyes, and I was like, who is that? That I thought was the end of it, but actually, recently I spoke to her during the book tour in D.C., and she's like, no, Nick, you actually came in the next week in a suit and gave a presentation on Baldwin's whole life in the 8th grade. So I completely repressed that. Much like I've repressed the process of writing this whole book, but I think that was sort of the first moment, and then I read Giovanni. I stole my twin sister's copy of Giovanni's Room the next year. So I think everybody has some kind of, love story with Baldwin early on.
I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about Baldwin's relationships with the women in his life. Mostly because, for me, the way he writes women in another country, the story Previous Condition, Beale Street, that the complexity and he allows women to be raw in a way that you rarely see from a male writer, but also that I think in that time you often rarely see from writers in general, right, including the women writers. It's not really permitted to be that complex, problematic, and Ida and characters like her really, when she slices up with her legs in that dance scene, it's like, wow, I'd never seen anything like that. So I'm just wondering, because his work mirrors his life so much, what were those relationships like from his mother on down?
Thank you so much for asking that, because even though it's structured through these 4 major male relationships, his relationships with women are threaded throughout, and they were so important. From his teacher, Bill Miller, also his mother, but then, Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison, Mary Painter, these letters that he wrote to her, Lorraine Hansberry. I mean, these women were so important. Just to give one example to answer your question, because there's so much to say about it. Toni Morrison came to visit him in St. Paul de Vence when he was working on If Beale Street Could Talk, because he made some popcorn, and it was late at night, and they stayed up all night down in his torture chamber, as he called it, his office, where he read the whole novel out loud to her to see if he was getting the voice right. And she said he was, although that's a really interesting example again of June Jordan thought he did not get the voice right at all. She said that sounds a lot like James Baldwin, not like a 19-year-old pregnant woman. But Joyce Carol Oates thought it sounded great. And part of the reason that I think it was both is that it was kind of drag. I mean, it was both him and Tish. And in a way, that slippage, how in drag, sometimes it's seamless and perfect, but then sometimes the mask slips, and you kind of see how it's constructed. I think that was happening there. It's like sometimes it's Tish, sometimes it's Baldwin, but then sometimes there's this slippage. And what that's actually pointing you to is the fact that he's telling these 2 love stories. He's telling this love story of Tish and Fonny in the novel, but behind that, he's also telling this story of his love story with Yoran Cazac. So that voice that comes out that sounds like him is him and it is Tish, but that's creative process, right? It always is this mixture of influences and voices. But there was one photo I couldn't include in the book because it was too grainy, but there's this beautiful photo I came upon of Baldwin and Toni Morrison together in the south of France, and they're holding hands, and they're smiling, and they look so happy. And it's one thing that I really wanted to get across in this book, and the female friendships are a big part of it, is going against this narrative that Baldwin lived this wholly tragic life, full of suffering, when in fact he had these incredible relationships that were so sustaining. They might not have looked like conventional relationships, but they were full of love, and also to fight against this tendency that can happen with Baldwin, but I think with black artists in general. Think of Toni Morrison. I'm sorry, not Toni Morrison. Think of Billie Holiday. This narrative of where black genius comes from is from tragedy and suffering. And I just don't think that's the case with Baldwin at all. I think that his genius lay in his ability and his desire to connect with other people.
Any other questions?
Hey, wanted to also convey my gratitude for this book. I had a chance to finish it this week and feels like one of the most important things I've read in my life.
Thank you so much.
Of course. I heard you say you repressed a lot about the process of writing this, so sorry for bringing this up again. But I guess one of the things that struck me, like early on, even just reading what it was about, was just like, wow, this was something really courageous to write, because I can only imagine like the risk of getting it wrong when it comes to writing about his life through this lens, and all the care that you took to talk about the racial aspects too. I was really floored by that. I'm curious if you could speak to when you decided to write a biography through the lens of his male relationships, and also, like, I can imagine perhaps there were points along the way where you were discouraged, and what allowed you to kind of push through that.
Okay, so I'm sensing two really good questions there. Toni Morrison has that famous saying, like, write the book that you want to read. And because I read the other biographies in college, and there were these gaps, and these sort of people would write sort of obliquely about these obviously really important relationships, I wanted to read that book. I didn't realize that I was going to write it someday. I didn't think that way. I really backed into this book over the course of 30 years. So I discovered this out-of-print children's book in college. I discovered that the artist who illustrated it was not dead as people thought. He actually ended up calling me and telling me, I'm alive, come to Paris. And then I was working on getting the book republished, which took 15 years because nobody wanted to republish a book written in Black English. And then I discovered that there was this like incredible love triangle going on behind that book. And I knew I wanted to write about that. But then it just started growing from there organically. I was like, well, actually, in order to understand Yoran Cazac and Baldwin, you have to understand Beauford Delaney, who introduced them to each other. And then I was like, well, wait a second. All of Baldwin's work is about love, all of it. And yet we haven't really explored what that meant to him in his life. So it wasn't like 30 years ago. I was like, I'm going to start writing a biography. It really was not until 2017 when the Schomburg archives became available. I was in an artist residency in Europe, and my agent called me on the phone, and she was like, what is this book? And I was like, I don't know what this book is. She's like, well, what is it about? I'm like, well, it's about love and his relationship. She's like, okay, so there's the book. It's about love and his relationship. So that was when I realized that that's what it was. The other part of your question, I forget what it was. Oh, I always felt discouraged. One of the most one of the interesting things so I won't even talk about before I got the book contract, because that's like long story out at nightclubs and stuff. But by the time I got the book contract and started it, it was during the COVID, and I was writing the beginning of the book when Baldwin is struggling to find his voice and struggling to become a writer, and he's trying to leave Harlem and Greenwich Village to get to Paris. And I wrote it, and that was like 100 pages, and it was terrible. But then as soon as I got to Baldwin's arrival in Paris, where he found his voice, I found my voice. I started it at a moment when he's at this gay bar, La Reine Blanche, meeting Lucien Happersberger. Remember that scene? And I just suddenly, I wrote it like a film. Like, you're in the bar and you're weaving through all these men drinking, and then he's telling this story. You can't see him because he's small, and then there's like a spotlight on Baldwin smoking a cigarette and speaking in bad French and telling the story that is from his essay Equal in Paris, The Stolen Bedsheet. And so kind of like it mirrored his journey somewhat, and I had to go back and rewrite the entire beginning of the book. Yeah. Thanks for your question.
Do we have any more questions?
I was curious, James Baldwin loved Black people so much, and I was curious if in writing the book you felt like there was things that you learned about the Black liberation struggle and how the evolution of it in studying this man's life.
Yeah, I mean, he shifted. We talked about he had massive shifts in his positions, and he spent a lot of time later in his career feeling bad that he hadn't been more involved in the Algerian liberation movement in Paris. He did not really hang out with those people. Then he wrote this really undervalued short story, This Evening, So Soon, about kind of an African-American family in Paris. And there's this really confusing scene where maybe a robbery happens and people pin it on the Algerian. And his last, he was working on a novel called No Papers for Muhammad, and it was based on his Algerian gardener. I think Baldwin had a lot of guilt, actually, about his lack of involvement there. He talked about that in interviews. And he had a really evolving, complicated relationship to Africa. So, for example, he attended that conference at the Sorbonne, and at this point, he didn't really get Pan-Africanism. People were trying to compare Richard Wright's Native Son and claim it as kind of African novel. And Baldwin was like, what are you talking about? This is an African-American novel. Baldwin was still invested in this kind of American exceptionalism early in his career. But that changed. He kept putting off visiting Africa because he was afraid, he said, of what it would stir inside of him. But when he went, he realized that all of his fears had been wrong. He felt a deep connection when he went to Ghana, for example. So again, his positions is something that I admired about it, is that he, if you read his writing, is to read thinking on the page happening, right? Especially in his essays. And he was willing to be honest about, he's growing up and he's saying, I hated myself because my people didn't produce Shakespeare. That's a brave thing to say, right? But that's not how he evolved away from that. That was just him as a child. A similar relationship, I would say, to Africa and to the liberation movements.
It is with some personal embarrassment that I have to admit that when I first saw that banner behind you on the website, I immediately assumed that you were the writer and you were the interviewer. So imagine my surprise when I bought the book and I looked at the back cover. So it's obvious that this passion has been with you for a long time, but even then that may not be enough to attract the right type of attention that you need to undertake this monumental task. How did you convince others that you were the right person? Never mind what your own imposter syndrome may have been, presenting itself in front of you. But how did you convince others that you were the right person to write such a monumental piece?
That's a new one. I mean, I've had the questions about being a white man writing this biography, which I completely welcome. Michelle Norris and I just had a big talk about it on Substack. The question of how I had to convince people is not one that I got, but thank you. That's really interesting, because you're right. I did have to convince people. I think I think that's one reason, but I think it was a good thing, because that's one of the reasons that this took so long, is that I had to do all of my research, right? I had to really, one of the problems that can happen when people write from outside their culture, right, is that it's like tourism. They just go and do it, they don't jump into it, and then they jump out of it. And then the work isn't very good. Book has to be judged, in my opinion, on the strength of its research, how seriously it's taken. So this forced me to spend my life inside of that archive and inside of this work. But I don't really feel, it wasn't like I felt like I had to convince them, because I didn't know I was doing this. By the time I knew that I was doing this book, I had already helped to republish Little Man, Little Man. I had already published many, many essays in journals on Baldwin. And I think, most importantly for me, I had access to information that nobody else in the world had. And if I hadn't written this book, then that information would be more of those gaps that I encountered when I read David Leaning's biography that I wanted to fill. There are many other Baldwin biographies being written right now. There are excellent books out right now by Peniel Joseph about the Freedom Season. It's the year 1963. Baldwin features prominently in that. So the thing is, there's no definitive end. It's not like this book has been written and we're done with Baldwin. Quite the contrary. There's still books being written about the place of black women in the civil rights movement. And there was such a kind of simplistic vision of Baldwin and of the civil rights movement. For example, I was thinking during the poetry reading, a great book would write Baldwin's life through those three relationships that he was trying to do in Remember This House: Malcolm, Medgar, and Martin. That would be a really interesting book. His relationship with his brother David is super fascinating, and that's a big part of my book. But there's so much more to write. So I wrote a proposal for the book, and based on so many years of research, and I think that could convince people to support it in publication.
I was wondering if you could just address the way that Baldwin related to maybe diaspora and immigration and national identity a little bit.
Oh wow! I mean, in every way. I mean, he wrote all the time about how this was a country of immigrants, right? And I think he was moving towards, Stranger in the Village was really, that's what he's writing about, being the only black man in this village. But he used that to reflect, the last line is, "The world is white no longer, and the world will never be white again." He wasn't just talking about the U.S. I mean, he was using that experience, that kind of transatlantic experience abroad, to talk about kind of Western civilization, right, in a much larger way, and how it did not account for the reality of the diaspora. So everywhere in his essays, he's writing about that. But I've thought about him a lot these last months and years in terms of the immigration BS that's happening, and what he would say about it, and how all of his writing really was about how the American, sort of this fraudulent notion of American innocence, right, on the part of white America, that there is this kind of stable, unitary American identity is just a fiction, right? And so, thank you. There's so much to say about that. I could say more. Thank you for that question.
We have time for one or two more. Do we have any additional?
So one of the interesting parts of your book is where you talk about how he started his career with sort of a takedown of Richard Wright. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the intergenerational conflict there between the two of them, and also Langston Hughes, I think, was critical of his writing early on.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if that's just sort of characteristic of that part of the 20th century, and just interested in hearing more about that.
Yeah, his relationship with Wright and Hughes was interesting. I mean, there was particularly at that moment this dominant idea, ridiculous one, that there could only be one great black writer, right? That it was Richard Wright, and then Ralph Ellison, Baldwin, and then finally Toni Morrison. A woman was allowed into it, when in fact the history of African American literature, from Zora Neale Hurston, to Alain Locke, to Countee Cullen, to Langston Hughes, it's just, there's such a diversity within that tradition. But that was the model back then, and Baldwin knew that, and Baldwin was very ambitious. So a couple of things were happening as I write about in the book when he wrote those essays. One, he was broke, and this was one way to get himself on the map. Two, he really was trying to figure out the novel that he wanted to write, Go Tell on the Mountain, and he knew that it wasn't. This was right before he went off to the Swiss Alps. He knew that it wasn't, he didn't want to do the Harriet Beecher Stowe model, and he tied that to Richard Wright. But what was also happening underneath that is that Richard Wright was reportedly sort of very uncomfortable with Baldwin's sexuality, so they were having that kind of struggle. With Hughes, I think something similar was going on. Hughes was sort of closeted, and then here's this younger figure who's about to hit it big, and there was still a lot of, I think, respect among all three of them, and also with Chester Himes. But I think that Baldwin knew, I think it's unfortunate that Richard Wright felt the way that he did about Baldwin, but I also think that what Baldwin did was a little messed up, and I don't shy away from that in the biography. I felt Richard Wright helped him. There's an incredible Richard Wright in the Village. Baldwin went out to Crown Heights, and he helped him get a fellowship. He helped him find a home when he got to Paris. Whatever misgivings he might have had about his sexuality, he was certainly he recognized genius. He recognized kinship. And so I think Baldwin later wrote that he regretted what he did, but even as he wrote that he regretted it, he kind of repeated what he was saying. So the irony, of course, is that later in his career, what Baldwin had been critiquing Wright for writing quote-unquote protest literature, is exactly what was used against him later in his life. So I guess what goes around comes around? I don't know.
Do we have any more questions?
I would just finish that by saying, what Baldwin was different is that Baldwin in his late in his career really was supporting younger writers like Cecil Brown, Carol Phillips. He wasn't like that later in his life. He was supporting Toni Morrison, Gail Jones. He was supporting black women writers, young black writers. So he didn't repeat, I think, the problems of that past model at all.
Hey, Nicholas. So I haven't finished the book yet.
But it's so short.
I know, right? But what I blame it on is I keep getting sidetracked. I find names, and I'm like, oh, who was that? And I go look up that name, and But I want to. The question I want to ask, I think, is really related to. I mean, it's Baldwin, a love story. What I cannot reconcile is Arnold. No one knows exactly who Arnold was, and I don't understand that because he was such a, he was in Baldwin's life for few years. Yeah, few years.
But Arnold was a young jazz musician that Baldwin was involved with. That it was the model for Sonny's Blues. That went to Corsica with him, a place where Baldwin, when they broke up, attempted to take his own life. So he was a very important figure, and that's something that is important to remember is that Baldwin, sometimes there's this notion that Baldwin, was only interested in white men. Not true at all. He was involved with several men of color later in his life, and one of them is Arnold. There's also Alain, who's West Indian, and then Max Petrus, his sort of final late lover. People have tried. I mean, Arnold's last name, we believe, is Williams. You know how many Arnold Williams there are out there? And he really kind of disappeared in a sad way that I don't want to give away. But what did happen is that Max Petrus, who was Baldwin's late lover, who took a lot of the photographs of him, like his author photograph for Just Above My Head is by Max Petrus. I did find Max Petrus, and he was so generous. He allowed me to use, free of charge, which did not happen often, these incredible photographs of Beauford Delaney late in his life. One of them, a color photograph, is in the thing. But he didn't really want to meet up and talk, So I had to sort of respect that. I wasn't gonna push. So I believe that Arnold and Alain are probably no longer with us, but it's possible that they are. But it is important to kind of underscore how important these relationships were. However, they were shorter relationships. He didn't dedicate or books to them or collaborate with them, and I chose the figures that he really was involved with over the course of many crisscrossing years, who inspired him, who sustained him, and who he had this kind of like unrequited relationship with, or not wholly unrequited, but that powered his creativity. But there's a lot to be said about Arnold. Kind of a sad story for sure. But I will just end it by saying one thing that Baldwin did in these relationships is that once he loved somebody, he never stopped loving them. Even if they broke up, he always made sure that he helped them get settled in their lives on the other side of the breakup. Especially if they were breaking up with him, Arnold would be an example. So that was kind of how he approached all of these love relationships.
Nicholas Boggs, Keenan Norris, Daniel Summerhill, thank you so much for this beautiful evening. Baldwin, A Love Story is available for purchase at the back. We take all sorts of payment. Those